What I'm going to do to start with, because I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Pacific Maritime Association and what our scope is, I like to start with like a PMA 101, kind of a who, what, where, and why, a little 2-minute commercial, if you will. Who are we? We are a multi-employer association with 75 member companies, and our member companies consist of liner carriers, terminal operators, and stevedores. And as mentioned, our principal business responsibility is to negotiate and administer the collective bargaining agreement with the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. But we also do a lot more than that. We hire them, we fire them, we discipline them, we arbitrate work issues and disputes, we dispatch them, we payroll them, and we train the workforce. So it's truly a cradle-to-grave operation. And where do we perform these activities? We represent the maritime industry in all aspects and dealings with the 23,000 longshoremen that are employed in the 29 West Coast ports of the United States. Exception being direct supervision on the job. Once we dispatch people to a job for that day or for that week, then that terminal management directs their activity. However, if there are any problems on the docks, we're generally involved in their resolution. And finally, and this is probably as important as anything, why does the PMA exist? In 1938, an NLRB decision certified one bargaining unit to represent all dock workers on the west coast of the United States, and that was the ILWU. And that came out of a lot of struggle. As you remember, back in the day, we had Bloody Thursday down the docks in San Francisco. And when the NLRB came in, they really said, we want calm, we want quiet. You know, we figure if it's one union, all will be good with the world. And as a result of the ILWU being put in place, the employers evolved from company-specific to regionally focused, and ultimately to a coastal approach in managing the workforce. Because if we were too regional or too company-focused, the workforce began to realize they could whipsaw the employers, and it was just a steady staircase up. And it's really important to note the differences between the West Coast labor agreements and the East Coast labor agreements. On the East Coast, the longshoremen, the East Coast and the Gulf, the contract only covers containers, okay? And there is competition from non-union and other unions that compete with the longshoremen in those ports themselves. On the West Coast, we have a regulated monopoly, okay, where all work, whether it's containers, break bulk, cruise, is done by ILW members and is covered by a master contract which I negotiate. And there is no competition from other unions or non-union entities. So as you can imagine, that creates kind of a very interesting scenario when you talk about leverage. It's not that you can go out and replace your workforce. It's not that there are other people that do this work. The government says this is the labor unit that will perform this work on the West Coast. So having said that, hopefully that put what I do into a little bit of context for you. We are in all 29 West Coast ports. Biggest operation, I'm in San Francisco with the financial groups, and then in each port area we have anywhere from 30 to just a couple of people, depending on how big the operation. Obviously, Southern California being the biggest of that. So for the rest of the morning, or primarily the rest of the morning, I'd like to focus on the last 3 contracts and kind of build you into the thinking. I've been involved in them all, and it really has been, I think, a very well laid out plan on how are we going to move the West Coast ports forward. And it's unique when you look at what's happening on the East and Gulf Coast, because some of the things that we did 15 years ago, they still haven't been able to do from an automation perspective. So 2002, 2008, and 2014, we really developed a strategy that continued to evolve through the terminal operations, all with a focus on how do we become more efficient. But before I get into those contracts themselves, there is a disclaimer. I'm not going to get into all the gory details. I'll kind of wrap it up with, what we got, what they got. But ultimately, we all know that it's a give and take proposition when you're in contract negotiations, particularly when you're in a monopoly situation, okay? So there's no such thing as a free lunch, and for the things that we were able to receive, certainly the union got things back too, right? Not a one-way street. So let's start looking at the contracts themselves. If you go back to, this really started prior to 2002. And as we got ready to go into 2002 negotiations, there were two real drivers behind the employer's desire to change the way we operated. The first was West Coast volumes were forecast to at least double over the next 10 years. Okay, so that was the first driver. And the second, the container terminals were significantly limited in their ability to expand. All these terminals are in urban areas. The footprint is the footprint, right? You can't go out. So you got to go up and you got to go faster. That's the only way we were going to be able to handle this volume. So the bottom line to it was the West Coast terminals, we needed to fundamentally change the way we operated if we were going to be able to continue to grow the business, continue to accept cargo from Asia. Because without it, other options would have had to be developed. So the first step in that evolution of the terminal operations was what we consider the technology framework. And it gets a little bit confusing, but technology is not automation in our world. Okay, technology was really just the free flow of electronic information into and out of the facilities without human intervention. Okay? Prior to 2002, every time a piece of paper was handled or rehandled, or information was updated, or cargo was updated, a clerk would rekey it. Okay? So you had all over these terminals, out in the lanes, people rekeying information. And what this agreement said was, there's no more rekeying of information. We can use, GPS, optical character recognition. We can use just free flow from the customer in and out of the terminals. Nobody has to touch it. Okay? And because of that, it was very straightforward. Clerk work assignments would change and be eliminated. All right? If you're redundant, then you're redundant. And the whole premise behind this was, if we don't get faster, we're not going to be able to handle more cargo. If we do get faster, we are going to be able to handle more cargo, so we'll need more people on more shifts. Not more people on a given shift, but to spread them across a 7x24 operation. And one of the real big deliverers in this one was that the contract specifically says that no matter what previous contracts said, no matter what past practices were, no matter what arbitration rulings were, that this supersedes everything else. So we started to come out of the 19th century of, it's always been like this, we're always going to do like this, and we have all these practices, and this is how we're going to work our operation. So we're slowly starting to change the mindset that just because we always did it like this doesn't mean we're going to keep doing it like that. And 2002 was the first real example of that. What did the union get for that? Well, they got wage increases, they got pension increases, they got maintenance and benefits, and they got a clerk work guarantee. So if those clerks were displaced, they were going to get their 40 hours, as long as they made themselves available for work. But again, the whole premise was bring in more cargo, more shifts. We won't have too many clerks, and we didn't. Okay, so that's how it played out. But if you go back to 2002, this was the first time that employers really took on the union and said, we're going to change things. We don't have a choice. If we're going to survive or we're going to compete, we have to change the way that we do business. So what happened? We had a 10-day strike. We had a TaftHartley injunction. The president got involved. Dianne Feinstein, I think, was one of the biggest covers for him to come in and say, okay, cooling off period 80 days. And I would tell you the only reason it was resolved in that 80-day period, because we were scared to death that if we didn't find a way to resolve it, it was going to go back to Washington, D.C., and Congress was going to fix it for us. You can imagine what that would have looked like. So after a 10-day strike, it took us 3 months to recover and cost us $10 billion. Okay, so now that's the jumping off point for as we go through the next two. So you fast forward to 2008. Prior to 2008, we had no language that allowed us to automate the facilities. Everything was going to remain manual. Everything's going to remain the way like I said, the way we've always done it. So in 2008, the employers came to the realization, okay, now we got free flow of information. We need to automate these things. We need to go faster, faster, faster. So the total focus was, it was absolutely necessary to get automation language into the contract. During the contract, the employers were successful in gaining new automation language, which provided the efficiencies that we needed, and recognized that as we automated facilities, the equipment, and this is key, will replace and or displace traditional longshore work and workers. Okay, so again, this is no longer, this is, you know, work for life. This is, don't get to keep doing what you always did. We're going to automate these facilities. It's going to change the nature of the business itself, and you're going to have to get retrained, be able to operate. So if you look at the terminals now that are under construction, look at TradePac, LBCT, you go in those facilities and there's nobody on the ground, right? These machines, when they need maintenance, they drive themselves to the shop and they fix. They go and they switch out batteries. Guys that are working in the cranes are sitting, I don't know, city block away from where they're working. They're in joysticks in offices. So all of these things that have been, you know, so driven into our brains from a conventional terminal perspective are really starting to be revolutionized, right? And as you step back from it and you say, okay, so, you know, seems like a lot of work for what? Well, it's faster, it's more efficient. It does take less people, it's less costly. Huge capital investment on the front end, but the payback is certainly worth the effort itself. And simply put, automated cargo handling equipment for terminal operators, key statement, with no minimum manning. So it's men as needed. Okay? If you look at the Eastern Gulf Coast, I worked back there. They were gang sizes. You know, 32 guys in a gang. This says it's men as needed. You need one guy, you get one guy. You need 10 guys, you get 10. Right? So again, we're slowly changing the dynamic of how labor and management are interacting with one another and how these terminals will evolve over the next 20 years. Now, automation was a huge deal. In my opinion, it overshadowed technology by a huge margin. So when we walked into 2008, we said, World War III, right? Got 10 days last time around for technology. We're going to get 20 days this time. We're doing twice as much volume. Hell, man, this is going to cost us $50 billion and we're going to be down for 3 months, right? Resolve the contract 3 weeks after it expired with no disruption to operations. So again, it's kind of a take back on, all right, are we changing the mindset? Is everybody getting on board now? They know where we're going? Then we came to 2014. I will tell you, 2014, there were no major issues on the table. No huge, insurmountable, gotta have, we don't have, or from the other side either. It was a lot of little, tiny issues that nobody could get over. The head of the union had a whole new negotiating committee. There was 35 guys on his side, and there's probably 20 on my side. Only he and I talked, but all these new bodies, every time anything came up, there's caucus. Everybody's outside. 3 hours later, they're back inside. You talk for 20 minutes, caucus, everybody out there. But it was new blood. It wasn't his old guys who grew up in the industry that kind of all thought alike and could, you know, convince one another what to do. So it was very splintered, and nothing got done. I won't even say quickly. Nothing got done. We started dealing with port issues, little tiny port issues, and that had nothing to do with the coast contract. And it just kind of spun out of control. And you know, I keep saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? You got to get back in the box. And he said, I'm trying. I think the real breaking point was when we agreed after 7 months to let the FMCS come in and at least look at it from a mediator's perspective. Now they have no authority to make you do anything, but they can certainly suggest things. And when the mediator got out there, he was an individual that probably had 40 years of mediation. He figured he'd be there for 2 weeks. He was there for 4 months. And the last 3 weeks of it, I had the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Commerce, the Mayor of Los Angeles sitting in my office trying to figure out, you know, when are you going to get this done, right? But it's never that easy. And the issue that ended up being the cornerstone of the negotiations was about our arbitration process. And somebody asked me about that earlier today. Our arbitration process was very, very archaic and went back since the beginning of time, so to speak. And there was one union arbitrator and two union arbitrators and two employer arbitrators in each section of the West Coast. So you had one in the PNW, you had one in Oregon, you had one in Northern California, one in Southern California. The caveat to it all was that you couldn't get rid of an arbitrator unless you both agreed to, right? Well, the union arbitrator did what the union wanted them to do, so they weren't getting rid of them. The employer arbitrators, although I believe played a lot more down the middle, they still had to have their allegiance, and they had bias. So the system was not objective at all. So the focus became, we got to change it. And to change it, what we came up with was, we went to 3 arbitrators in each area. We went to one union, one employer, and one professional neutral, okay? Which was, mind-boggling to people looking from the outside and the union in general, because here's a practice that had been in place forever, right? Now you're saying the guy doesn't have a job for life, that at the end of the term, either one of you can fire him. That's the whole purpose, objectivity. And it was all done to protect the gains we made from the technology agreement and the automation agreement. So there was method behind the madness itself. I think as you look at the randomness of how the arbitrators now work, there's a job dispute. Arbitrator gets called out, he gets called out randomly. Could be a union guy, could be an employer guy. The neutral does not go out on the job sites themselves. But just that randomness has absolutely almost done away with anything happening on the docks themselves. It is so quiet out there that it's kind of eerie, because people are afraid who's showing up. Am I going to get his guy, my guy? And it has really gone a long way in kind of settling things down. Again, the union got wages, they got pension, they got MOB, and they got some jurisdiction. But as you look at it, the gains that we were able to accomplish, certainly, from just a pure selfish perspective, will help, everybody in this room going forward from a productivity perspective, from an efficiency perspective, from be able to get things on and off the docks themselves. And that again was the focus itself. The takeaway, negotiations were long, they were painful. At the end of them, we did reach agreement, and I think both sides would say, yeah, it's a fair agreement. I didn't get all I wanted, you didn't get all you wanted. It's okay. But we got there by exacting a heavy price on the shipping community, you guys, the economy, and the industry. Since the contract was ratified, we've seen a flurry of activity in Washington, D.C., calling for maritime legislation, attempting to mitigate or stave off future disruptions. There is a belief among the sponsors that the current negotiation process is not sustainable and has the potential to cause irreparable harm to the economy. I agree. So it's clear to me that the challenges that both management and the union face is the need for predictability and reliability. And to that end, it's incumbent upon us to find a better path forward. And my concern is if the parties do not improve the current negotiation process, then outside intervention becomes much more likely. I can tell you since the end of those negotiations, I probably hear from the Secretary of Labor every 60 days, what's going on? What are you guys doing? So does the head of the union, what's going on? What are you doing? We get calls from mayors, what's going on? What are you doing? So, people are engaged now at a level that they were never before. And we brought it on ourselves, right? I mean, we said, somebody better come help us here because we're not getting to where we need to be. So there is a lot more interest, a lot more involvement, and I think it's only going to get greater. And if in fact we ever do get in a position where we get into these elongated negotiations, I can guarantee you they will be front and center a lot sooner than when we're 9 months into it. And that's without saying. Having said all that, what do I expect during this contract cycle? Labor peace. We almost always have labor peace or in a contract cycle. Both parties cooperate with each other, do what they need to do. We have, a process inside our contract that if there are disputes, there's a very logical, pragmatic way to go through and resolve them. So from here until June 1st of 2019, there will be no disruptions. My biggest concern would be the chassis situations in the terminals themselves. But from a labor perspective, I don't see anything. But let's go a step further. I don't know if any of you were at the TPM conference in March of last year, but at the TPM, Bob McElrath and I were asked about a potential extension to the contract itself. And Bob's response was, if Jim asked me formally to get into extension discussions, I will take it to my guys and we will strongly consider it. So I formally asked him. So at the end of that meeting in March, I sent him a letter saying, we need to get into formal discussions about an extension. He took it to his caucus in August and came back to me and he said, my guys have decided we'll explore the possibility. And we had our first meeting this past Monday. And I would tell you, I was encouraged by it. It was professional. It was positive. I think the word that was used by both sides of the table the most frequently was stability. And this is all evolution from the last three contracts itself and from the amount of scrutiny that both parties are going to get. Where do we go from here? Well, we have other meetings scheduled. This is not going to be a long, drawn-out process. I mean, this is not, we're doing a contract renegotiation. This is an extension. So there'll be 2, maybe 3 items talked about, one of them being how long is the extension. So as you can imagine, if you don't have a lot to talk about, you're either going to reach agreement pretty quickly or you're not. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get there, but again, only time will tell. Okay? Let me switch gears for just a second here. And I'd like to talk about the current state of the maritime industry in general. And there are some headlines here, and the first headline is global container volumes are on track for their worst year since 2009. And since the financial crisis, the shipping industry has been squeezed on both the supply and demand side, i.e. too many new and bigger vessels without scrapping any, while global trade has slowed. By the numbers, 0 container growth in 2016. Well, there was 30% more vessel capacity, which lead to declining freight rates, which predictably has led to the industry forecasting they're going to lose $8 to $10 billion this year. Now, as a result of all that, economic challenges, formations of mergers, acquisitions, and alliances. To date, we have CMA purchase of APL. We have the merger of Costco, China Shipping. We have the just announced 3J, NYK, MOL, K-Line, Nuco. And we have the alliance of Maersk and MSC, with more likely to come. I would say of the 20 largest liner carriers, 8 of them sit on my board. They're all in deep, deep red. So change is happening. I have never seen change happen this quickly in this industry. In my previous 37 years, I've never seen anything like it's happened in the last 3 years. And it's not over. It is truly not over. There are other signs of economic challenges. Everybody knows about the Hanjin bankruptcy, all right? Then we get into the slowdown in the China world, the world's biggest exporter. And the anemic economic growth that we're experiencing in the US, 1.2%. And you look at the Eurozone, second quarter they did 0.3%. And what's Brexit going to do to them? God only knows. So there's a lot of real uncertainty out there. As we look at the bigger economy itself, over the next 9 to 10 years, all the smart guys out there are predicting slow container growth with 2% or less GDP. We usually track with the GDP. And 2% or less consumer price inflation, which they kind of go hand in hand. So while I look at the future of the maritime industry as being very unclear, I can tell you it isn't very rosy, at least in the short and midterm cycles. And as the mergers and alliances continue to shake out, there will absolutely be winners and losers. So stay tuned. It's going to get even more interesting over the next year or so. Thank you, and I'm open for any questions you may have.
Actually, the lower volume, is that limited to the West Coast ports or all the ports?
I would tell you since 2001, the West Coast used to handle a little over 50% of the volume that comes in and out of the country. Now we're at about 40%. So the split now is 60 to 40. Now 60% is, it's not only what's happening on the East Coast and the Gulf, but also Canada's player in there. So yeah, there have been winners, guys that have gained cargo. And every time we've had a work disruption, logically cargo has left. And when we're out of that cycle, not all of it's come back. And I think that's what has the union and employers saying, this has got to stop. There's got to be certainty in this, or this trend is just going to continue.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping to hear.
Yep.
And now I have 3 questions.
Oh no, you said one.
Well, I got the Panama Canal, will that change anything for the West Coast?
I think initially when the Panama Canal was discussed, people were, it's the end of the world. This is going to flip everything on its head. The reality of the situation, the freight that goes through the Panama Canal is more driven by the price of the rails than it is by West Coast operations. And I think the railroads, with their investments over the years, were not about to let the Panama Canal walk away with their cargo. So you're seeing intermodal rates come down as well. So there's a balance there, and the difference hasn't been huge to date. Now, what will it happen in the next 2 or 3 years? Hard to say.
Okay, and then finally, this is simply curiosity. Most everybody in here remembers Reagan and air traffic controllers. Could the president have stepped in this situation? Not that he would have, but could he?
He could have invoked the TaftHartley. Okay. I think this president made it very clear to both sides he wasn't going to do it. Right? He just said from the very beginning, when the Secretary of Labor was in Congresston, he's not going to do it. Now, ultimately, he would have had to. If I would have locked him out or they would have went on strike, it wouldn't happen in 10 days. It would have been 30 days. I don't know. It would have been some other number, though, and it would have been longer than 2002.
It's difficult for us to swallow one union being able to affect so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Courtney Neff, I'm with the National Pork Producers Council, and on the advisory board for the Ag Transportation Coalition.
Sure.
You're exactly right in that it's extremely frustrating and there's a lot of damage to exports, especially perishable goods. So are we in Washington, D.C. trying to get some tangible action when TaftHartley is an option? One result of that was a provision within the highway bill of the Ports Metrics Act. What is the vibe of that being received on a West Coast port? And as this group is needing to figure out what those metrics should be, how will that actually result in change to avoid a disruption? We just simply can't afford that. So I really want your perspective.
From what I've heard, I don't sit on that committee. I know people that do. It's pretty bogged down. Not a lot of action, not a lot of traction. I would tell you that we payroll all the guys. We have that information for every port, for every terminal, for everything. And it's in an annual report that we publish every year. I mean, it is there. So to recreate it, to me seems, I don't know why we're doing. Now, the Eastern Gulf Coast is different. They're into little silos, and they do it by port association, and the information isn't as readily available. But I don't think it's getting the information. I think it's what are you going to do when you get the information? Because in 2002, when we had the strikes, we said, here are the books. This is what they do. They're slowing down. They used to do 30 moves an hour. They're now doing 22. That's the difference, right? And deaf ears. The government, in my opinion, until there's a strike or a lockout, and until things get on the verge of, almost collapse, are not going to intervene. They won't. They'll send guys out, try, Secretary Labor came out, and he and I got into a conversation, and he walked in the door with a preconceived notion of what was going on, and he said, you got to do this. And I said, I'm not going to do that. And he said, but this is why you got to do it. And I said, all right, now let me tell you why I'm not. And I sat with him and I explained, this is why I can't do this. It's not about this. It's about the precedent I'm setting that every time, they want something, that it's going to happen, and this will just steamroll on us. And after about 20 minutes, he looked at me and said, you're absolutely right. You can't do that. But nothing happened from there, right? We were still in. The scary thing was, it came down to the Friday that we consummated a deal. That Friday night at 5 o'clock, if we hadn't had a deal, the head of the union and myself were headed to Washington, D.C. And it wasn't going to be the presidents of these companies, it was going to be the chairman of their board from foreign countries sitting in Washington, D.C., negotiating a contract. And again, I think that was the ultimate fear that said, let's get it done.
So maybe not from a DC perspective, but from a producer perspective, we kind of felt and do feel held hostage by the port situation because they're so key.
Yep.
Port alone, 42% used to at least go by ocean right out of the West Coast. And so what can producers do, meat packing companies, et cetera, to protect their investment, protect their asset that needs to get on the water and get to our customers?
I would tell everybody in the room, it can't be episodic, right? I mean, the efforts to change what happened can't be solely tied to, is there a contract negotiation underway, whether it's the East Coast or the West Coast. It has to be an ongoing effort. I really do believe, after watching this thing evolve for the last 14 years I've been involved with it, that DC really is engaged now. I just don't think they know what to do with being engaged, right? I mean, it's all going to come down to what's the president going to say, yes, no. What are the head senators, yes, no. But I think it needs to be a clear avenue to a result. And right now, there's a lot of activity, but there's no real path forward. I think the fact that we're sitting down with the union, even discussing a contract extension, is unbelievable. Never happened before. When I first brought it to them, it was like, the world was ending. I can't do this. My guys will kill me. And they went through a lot of bloodletting even to get to the table. But again, they're not driven there because, geez, this really sounds like a good idea to us. I think they're feeling the pressure of this isn't an industry that's flying under the radar. We used to negotiate contracts in closed rooms, closed doors. Nobody got a word out. You didn't hear a peep. When we went in, the white smoke came out of the top and there was a contract, everybody was happy. All right? Not anymore. I mean, there is so much at stake with this, not only what we do, but who we do it to, that the level of interest, the level of pressure is raised on both parties, as it should. And it needs to stay there. And it's not just the union, it has to be the employers too. I mean, both sides have to be pressured in to making, contract decisions or contract agreements without getting to this breaking point. And this is a good first step. We'll see how it plays out.
Morning, Mr. McKenna. Thank you for coming and speaking to us today. My name is Bill Lehman. I'm on staff at the National Work Board. So, with the lessons and the battle scars that you have from working in this space, if you were king for a day the next time when the contract comes up for renewal, what 3 to 5 things would you like to see done differently?
I think that the number one thing is there has to be an extension of the contract. I mean, the contract has to live on until you reach agreement. In our world, the day the contract ends, there's no contract. So there's no grievance machinery, there's no arbitration process to bring disputes to resolution. So it becomes the Wild Wild West. That contract needs to stay in perpetuity until the next contract is signed. That's probably the one thing that would resolve all these problems. Now that's a mouthful. I mean, the union gets leverage from the fact that you don't have a contract. And I can go on strike tomorrow. And I can work slower because you don't have a way to get me in front of an arbitrator or someone else to, not only accuse me, but force me, to go back to my normal speed. In our normal world, in an arbitration process, if an arbitrator rules, that's it, right? That's what has to happen. There's one appeal process to a coast arbitrator who can say, yep, he's right, or nope, and he is God in our industry, right? So you have to implement that. And if you don't, you're in federal court the next day. So, I mean, the remedies are very quick and very swift, but without a contract, it's just open season. So for me, the one thing would be to have a contract live on in perpetuity, be the number one. I mean, all the other intervention and all those things, it's, you know, you're too much relying on who's in power, who's in office, you know, is it Democrat or the Republican, who's side, you know, all that. I think the most, again, pragmatic way to do it was say it lives on.
Any more questions? I have one here for you as well. While Bill makes his way to the mic here. You talked about extending the contract. You know, work should continue as it was prior to the contract extension.
Yep.
The problem we run into many of those times is that, you know, you see slowdown actions, you see a reduction in efficiency of labor operations, which creates as much damage. So how can that be resolved, you know, in the future while you're working on this contract extension?
They don't have a choice. They're under contract right now. Nothing that we're doing alters the fact that this contract is in place till June 30th of 2019. So part of the agreement that we signed on the front end of this, it was pretty lengthy, right? That this, don't have to do this, we're doing this, you know, a lot of different, but one of the things in there is there'll be no slowdowns. There'll be no anything that rocks this boat. And that was both sides saying, yeah, we just need this to protect both of us. But again, like I said, while you're under contract, you have methods, you have ways to resolve this. You have your arbitration process, you have a grievance process, you have your coast arbitrator, you have the federal courts. So it's not likely at all. And in fact, if it did, it'd be very short-lived.
Good morning, thank you for coming. Bill Weston with the Meat Institute. You mentioned that the West Coast ports have a small footprint. Do they have capacity now to accept these very large container ships that are coming online, or are there going to have to be some structural changes there? How do you see that going forward?
There are structural changes taking place now. A lot of the cranes are being raised down in Southern California. There's problems getting under bridges in some places. So there are some natural barriers to some terminals won't be able to work them, but some are fully equipped. There's enough water. It isn't a water issue. It's, do you have cranes high enough? If they don't, most of them are raised, and can you get under bridges coming in and out? I think the only place you're really going to see a concentration of will be Southern California. I mean, that's why all the automation is going on down there. It's, you know, that's the capital of our world, right? It's where most of the cargo goes. It's where the investment is, and that's where the cranes are getting hired. Yep. Yes.
Realistically, how do you think the unions would accept a contract that keeps going until they could come to some agreement?
Not well.
After 11.
Not
Yeah.
well. But a lot of unions, I've dealt with a lot of unions. A lot of unions, that's exactly what happens. Unless you reach a point where the other side says, I'm going on strike. Ours isn't an issue where anybody's going on strike or anybody's locking out, or was in 2002, but that's a real hard stop, right? Most of the time it's this, you know, death by 1,000 swords or 1,000 needles or whatever it is, that it's the slowdowns that bring you to a crawl, and it's really a strike in place. When you start slowing down from 32 moves to 20 moves, pretty soon everything starts backing up. You can't move in the terminal, can't get it out of the terminal. So that's the real killer. It's not, okay, we are a total disagreement, we're never going to come to agreement on this. Strike, lockout, fine. That's pretty straightforward. It's that in-between time. It needs to stay the norm while you're still in discussions. That'd be my point.
Conley Nelson Smithfield. Was just curious, listening to you, it seems like there's the tremendous amount of frustration in what you do. What keeps you doing this all the time, as long as you have?
Glutton for punishment. How about I don't know any better? I actually started on the docks in Oakland, California. Not as a longshoreman, but as a superintendent. And I've been in this industry for 40 years and in a lot of different countries, seen a lot of things. And I think probably one of the things that keeps me motivated is as you go to other countries and you see how they've evolved, It's pretty exciting. If you see what's happening down in Southern California now with LBCT and Trayback, it's pretty exciting stuff. I mean, you sit and you look out those windows and you see these huge machines running all over these facilities, not a person to be seen. It absolutely blows your mind. So I think just the absolute evolution of this industry and just how much it's fundamentally changing just keep me engaged.
There are no more questions. Jim, thanks very much for
My
sharing
pleasure.
your presentation.